I don't think people in other parts of the world use the term xenophobia as much as people in Africa. But the concept of xenophobia has been around for thousands of years. If you go to Africa, when most people hear the word xenophobia, one thing comes to mind. In 2008, South Africa experienced one of its worst outbreaks of xenophobic attacks and violences since the end of apartheid. What do I think about the current xenophobic attacks in South Africa? The government of South Africa needs to look into what was done in 2008, 2015 and 2019 that gave them those 4 and 7 years of grace and gap. Whatever your perspectives are, and regardless of what you think, I would like you to have an open mind as we go through this discussion. Hi, if you're seeing me for the very first time, welcome to this space where I talk about 4 major things: life, business, finance, and world politics, especially as it relates to Africa. My name is Osas Ferguson, and I'm so glad to have you here. Now, while you're at it, kindly hit the subscribe button, like, share with as many people as possible, and don't forget to hit the notification bell so you can always get notified anytime I drop new contents. So let's get right into it. Xenophobia. What is xenophobia? If you've been following the recent news about Africa, the term xenophobia would have come up more often. Now, I'm going to be telling you exactly what that means, and I'm also going to give you a brief history of how the word xenophobia became more popularized around the world, and particularly in Africa. In simple terms, xenophobia just means the fear or the dislike of strangers or foreigners. Now, this could be due to several reasons, like difference in political ideas, cultural differences, difference in perspectives, difference in skin color, difference in race, difference in religion. Whatever the reason may be, xenophobia simply just means the fear or the dislike of strangers or foreigners. Now, the word xenophobia is not a new word. It has been around for a very long time. As a matter of fact, it comes from the Greek language, and it's made up of 2 Greek words: xenos, which means stranger or foreigner, and then phobia, which we all know means fear. It's not a new word, like I said, and according to historians, the concept, not the word this time, but the concept of xenophobia has been around for thousands of years. However, I would like to think, and this is my own opinion, by the way, I would like to think that the concept must have been around for as long as humans have existed. And my reason is very simple, because if you think about it, most people are actually uncomfortable around strangers. So that's why I think the concept of xenophobia must have been around for as long as humans have existed. Then the word xenophobia itself became widely used in the 1800s and at the beginning of the 1900s, right? This was the time where more and more people migrated across Europe from one European country to another European country, and also across North America. So people used the word xenophobia to describe the hostility that strangers and foreigners or travelers or migrants experienced in their sojourn and in their travels across Europe and North America. Now let's go to Africa. In the current world of today, I don't think people in other parts of the world use the term xenophobia as much as people in Africa. If you go to Africa, when most people hear the word xenophobia, one thing comes to mind: the country of South Africa. Whatever your perspectives are, and regardless of what you think, I would like you to have an open mind as we go through this discussion. In 2008, South Africa experienced one of its worst outbreaks of xenophobic attacks and violences since the end of apartheid. Yes, I like to pronounce it that way, apartheid, because that's how I hear my South African brothers and sisters pronounce the word, apartheid. So they had one of their worst experiences or outbreaks of xenophobic attacks since the end of apartheid. Now, you have to understand that prior to 1990 and specifically 1994, South Africa experienced targeted racism towards the Black and brown South African folks. At that time, people could not, and by people I mean Black and colored South African folks, could not walk on certain sides of the street. They could not get certain jobs. They could not go to certain restaurants. And you have to understand that all of this was institutionalized in the South African rule and law. So all of this was the rule of law. It was the order of the day that Black and colored South African folks could not do certain things because of targeted racism. Now, fast forward to 1994, apartheid officially came to an end in South Africa. Then in 2008, almost 14 years later, right? 1994 to 2008, that's almost 14 years in between, South Africa experienced this very critical outbreak of xenophobic attacks and violence. This time around, the violence and the attack was quite different from how it had been prior to 14 years ago, prior to 1990 in South Africa. This time it was targeted at foreign African nationals living in South Africa. And the attacks were carried out by Black and brown South African folks. So you see the trajectory changed a bit from how it used to be prior to 1990 and 1994. This time around, foreign African nationals from countries like Mozambique, Zimbabwe, Somalia from the eastern part of Africa, Malawi, foreign nationals from all of these countries who were living in South Africa at the time were attacked. And according to history and according to the records, dozens of people lost their lives and thousands were displaced from their homes. If you look at the geography of Africa, countries like Zimbabwe, Malawi, Mozambique, all of those three countries are located in the southern part of Africa. So I don't think it's surprising to find that people from these countries will be living as foreigners in the country of South Africa. Because I mean, we are all neighbors, so it's normal to see that people will travel from those countries to South Africa. That's why you had most of the people who were the victims of that attack in 2008 were from these countries. And then Somalia is from the eastern part of the country, but you still had foreign nationals of Somalia living in South Africa at the time. Then in 2015 again, South Africa experienced another outbreak of xenophobic violence and attacks. This time, however, it was not as serious or as severe as what happened in 2008. This time, it wasn't just people from the previous countries that I mentioned. This time, you had people from countries like Ethiopia also caught in the clash. You had people from some other South African countries and, some other East African countries majorly. It was majorly East and South African countries at the time who were victims of these violences and attacks in 2015. So you see from 1994 to 2008, that's 14 years, like I earlier said. Then from 2008 to 2015, that's about 7 years in between. Now in 2019, 4 years later from 2015, there was another episode of xenophobic attacks and violence. You see, I'm giving you all of this history so you can have a bit of context and some perspective as to what has happened in South Africa prior to 1994, then in 2008, then in 2015, then in 2019, right? Because this gives you some level of perspective and some amount of context, basically. Then in 2019, another episode of xenophobic attacks again. The same thing, the same issue. However, this time around, more people were involved. Rather than majorly people from Southern African countries and Eastern African countries, foreign nationals from West African countries were also caught in the controversy, particularly people from Ghana and Nigeria, those two countries particularly. They were caught in the controversy. According to the records, there were lootings and destructions of businesses owned by foreign nationals. If you look at the progression of these attacks, these xenophobic attacks from 2008 up until 2019, and now in 2026, where we are seeing another episode of xenophobic attacks coming out of South Africa, you would realize that one thing has remained constant in the mouth of the vigilantes. And I call them vigilantes because the government of South Africa has not come out to officially say that they are in support of what these guys are doing. So I would like to call them vigilantes. One thing has remained constant in the mouth of these vigilantes, and that is they feel that the resources of South Africa have not been evenly shared or distributed amongst the people of South Africa. They feel that the foreign African nationals are slowly taking the resources that should have been meant for indigenous South Africans. What do I think about the current xenophobic attacks in South Africa? 1. Anytime the citizens of a country are continuously clamoring for something, it only means one thing. There are lapses and there are loopholes that need to be addressed quickly. Now, we looked at a bit of history from 2008 up till 2019 and now in 2026, where we are seeing another episode of xenophobic attacks out of South Africa. The government of South Africa needs to look into what was done in 2008, 2015 and 2019 that gave them those 4 and 7 years of grace and gap. Right now, I know there probably would have been some pockets of xenophobic activities within those years. However, whatever was done in 2008, in 2015, and in 2019 can be improved upon. That's one. Secondly, vigilantism should never be allowed to take the place of the government in the implementation and enforcement of rules and policies. The moment you allow vigilantism to take the place of the government in the enforcement of rules and policies, then chaos is bound to happen. Because that's the whole essence of a constitution. Because what exactly is the constitution? The constitution is simply a group of people saying, hey, we do recognize that we all have different views and different perspectives as to how things should be done. However, we also recognize that we need to agree on some binding policies that would keep us together as a group of people. That's exactly what a constitution is. Because if you allow different factions of people, different factions and groups of people who have similar ideologies to rise up to try and implement or enforce what they think is right, there's bound to be chaos. That's why vigilantism should never be allowed to take the place of the government. Vigilantism should not be allowed to take the place of the government in the enforcement and implementation of rules and policies. People have to act within the lines of the constitution. For example, in South Africa right now, there are some people who have come out to say, we do not like what is going on. We do not like the xenophobic protests. Some people are saying we need foreigners. Some people are saying, hey, we do not like how this is going. Some people are saying we want this, but we don't like how you're going about this. Some people are saying we don't even want this. These people are contributing to the economy of the country. Now, imagine if all of these different factions and groups of people rise up to try to enforce what they think is right. The country will be thrown into chaos. Now, finally, what are the consequences of what's going on in South Africa right now? So recently, in this recent outbreak of xenophobic attacks in this year, 2026, countries like Ghana and Nigeria, like Ghana has taken about 500 of its citizens living in South Africa out of South Africa. Nigeria has sent planes to bring in their citizens back from South Africa. Also, the Foreign Minister of Affairs in Nigeria, the person of Mrs. Bianca Ojukwu, came out and said, we have over 120 South African companies, and I quote, I'm quoting exactly what she said. We have over 120 South African companies operating freely in Nigeria without being disturbed. However, in South Africa, we have our citizens who are running their businesses being attacked by other South African nationals. Yet, the government of South Africa has not come out to make any official speech. Now, this was at the time she made this statement. The president of South Africa, President Cyril Ramaphosa, had not come out to make any official statements at the time. And she said, if the government of South Africa does not do anything to mitigate the issues on ground, there will be risks of retaliations or retaliatory sanctions to South African companies operating in Nigeria. Now, I don't know if the license of Optasia that was revoked was done as a response to what was happening in South Africa. I don't know. The government of Nigeria never said that was the reason. But I'm just saying, if the South African government does not take real steps to mitigate these issues, there will definitely be economic setbacks. And guys, this is not the time we want to have economic setbacks in Africa or in any African country. Because last I checked, the GDP of South Africa was about $400 and something billion. And the combined GDP of the top 5 African largest economies put together, the combined GDP, was not even up to the GDP of France. You know what that means? So this is not the time to have economic wars in Africa. We need to ramp up our productive capacity. This is not the time to allow for flimsy things to further drag down the economies of different African countries. That's why the government of South Africa needs to act and act fast. Also in Ghana, I know recently the South African billionaire Robert Herself, I hope I'm pronouncing that name right, Robert Herself, came out and warned the South African governments that they risk losing their gold mining operations in Ghana should the violence or the attacks, the xenophobic attacks in South Africa continue. Now, already, some groups of Ghanaians in Ghana, I saw this on the news the other day, some Ghanaians have come out to protest the gold mining operations of South Africans and South African businesses in Ghana. Now, also when I checked, I think the gold mining operations of South Africans alone in Ghana was valued at about $1.3 billion annually, approximately. That's in Ghana. What if the government of Nigeria now says, hey, we want to now retrieve or revoke the licenses of the prominent South African businesses? There is no how that those businesses would not be hit pretty hard. And this is not the time where we should be fighting these wars or these economic battles in Africa. This is Certainly not the time. We are trying, or we should be trying, to ramp up our economic or our productive capacity in Africa, because it's nothing to write home about to start with. So this is why the South African government, in my opinion, needs to act, and act very fast. I'm glad President Ramaphosa has already said something, although he made a statement shortly after the Optasia license was retrieved. I don't know if that was what triggered it. I mean, there is no way to say if that was what triggered his making his speech, or he's making the public or official statement. But yes, kudos to him. So guys, I would like to hear what you think in the comment section. Tell me everything you think. Tell me what you think was said correctly and what you think was not said correctly. Peace. See you in the next one.